To be or not to be. Now, sooner or later, an actor will find themselves declaiming those words, whether it's delivering Hamlet's soliloquy or reflecting on the precarious career prospects of the thespian calling. And if the answer turns out to be in the not to be direction, then the follow-up question is, what else might you be? And if you have a leaning towards high-risk options, you might select become an entrepreneur as an alternative choice. Torquay is a drama queen of a town, displaying itself in the summer for the tourists who flock to the English Riviera, attracted by its mild weather and occasionally sparkling blue bay. Full of larger-than-life characters, birthplace and home of Agatha Christie, and still hosting plenty of theatres to add to the offstage stories playing out in the streets. And tucked away in the town cemetery is the last resting place of one of the largest of such characters, an actor and entrepreneur to the end, Isaac Merritt Singer, father of the sewing machine and responsible for much more besides. He was born in 1811 in Pittstown, New York, and Singer was the youngest of 8 children, and from an early age someone who had to learn to hustle, taking on various odd jobs, including learning the skills of joinery and lathe turning. But his passion for acting emerged early. When he was 12, he ran away to join an acting troupe called the Rochester Players. Now, even in those days, acting was not a reliable profession. And so when he was 19, he worked as an apprentice machinist. That was a move which helped support his early days of family life. He married young, he married 15-year-old Catherine Haley, and he had 2 children with her before finally succumbing once again to the siren call of the stage, joining the Baltimore Strolling Players. But his machinist studies paid off, however, when in 1839 he patented a rock drilling machine. Now, he'd been working with an older brother to help dig the Illinois waterway and saw how he could improve the process. It worked, and he sold it for $2,000, which would be worth about $150,000 in today's money. More important, this windfall gave him the chance to return to the dramatic world, and he formed his own troupe known as the Merritt Players. On tour, he appeared on stage under the name Isaac Merritt, with a certain Mary Ann Sponsler, who called herself Mrs. Merritt. Backstage, they looked after a family which had begun growing in 1837 and had swollen to what eventually became 8 children. Their tour lasted about 5 years, during which time he became engaged to her, neglecting to mention that he was already married. Fortunately, he'd kept up his craftsman skills and interests and developed and patented a machine for carving wood and metal on April the 10th, 1849. By then financially struggling, once again he moved the family back to New York City, hoping to market this machine. He built a prototype, but more important, he met a bookseller, G.B. Zeber, who was going to become his partner and long-suffering financier. Unfortunately, the prototype was destroyed in a fire, and Zeber persuaded Singer to make a new start in Boston in 1850, using space in a workshop kindly offered by Orson Phelps, who ran a small machine shop in the town. Unfortunately, orders for his woodcutting machine were not forthcoming, and so eventually he turned his inventive eye to the world of sewing machines. Let's just for a moment look at a short history of sewing machines, because people had started sewing by hand around 20,000 years ago, when the first needles were made from bones or animal horns and thread made from animal sinew. But it remained largely a manual process until the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century and the growing demand for clothing, which manual labour couldn't really meet. So what's called demand-pull innovation prompted plenty of entrepreneurs to try their hands at improving on the basic manual process. Their task wasn't easy. Sewing's a complex task involving different materials whose shape isn't fixed in the way that wood or metal can be. And manual labour was still cheaply available, so the costs of any machine to replace it would also need to be low. Not surprisingly, many of the early inventors died in straitened circumstances. A German-born engineer who was actually working in England, a man called Charles Frederick Wiesenthal, can probably lay claim to one of the first patents awarded for a mechanical device to aid the art of sewing. It was issued in 1755. But this was more of a mechanical aid. It wasn't until 1790 that an English cabinet maker by the name of Thomas Saint was granted a patent for 5 different types of varnishes and their uses, a machine for spinning, twisting and doubling the thread, a machine for stitching, quilting or sewing, and a machine for plaiting or weaving. A specification which didn't quite include the kitchen sink, but came pretty close to covering it. His very broad-ranging patent somewhat obscured its real value. That machine he envisaged for stitching, quilting or sewing. So much so that when the Patent Office republished some of their older patents and arranged them into new classes, Saint's patent was placed into wearing apparel rather than sewing and embroidering machinery. But his machine brought together several novel features, including a mechanism for feeding material into the machine and a vertical needle. It was particularly designed for working with leather to make saddles and bridles, but it was adapted for other materials like canvas to make ship sails. Now, Saint's vision somewhat outstripped his ability to actually make and sell the machine, but his underlying model introduced the key elements of what became the basic configuration for a sewing machine, the dominant design for a sewing machine. Much later, in 1874, a person already making sewing machines, William Newton Wilson, found Saint's old drawings in the UK Patent Office, made a few adjustments, and built a working machine which is still on display in the Science Museum and which demonstrates the idea behind his sewing machine. But of course, Saint wasn't alone in seeing the possibilities in mechanizing sewing. Innovation often involves what's called swarming. Many players see the potential and then experiment with different designs, borrowing and building on these as they converge towards something which solves the core problem. And eventually, this becomes the dominant design. So, in the following years, in the 1790s and beyond, various attempts were made to develop a viable machine, some more successful than others. In 1804, 2 Englishmen, Thomas Stone and James Henderson, built a simple sewing device, and someone else called John Duncan in Scotland offered an embroidery machine. An Austrian tailor, Joseph Madersberger, presented his first sewing machine publicly in 1814. And in 1818, John Doge and John Knowles invented America's first sewing machine, though it could only sew a few bits of fabric before it broke down. But it wasn't really until 40 years after Saint's patent that a viable machine emerged. A Frenchman, Barthélemy Thimonier, who was a tailor, invented a machine that used a hook needle and one thread, creating a chain stitch. The patent for his machine was issued on the 17th of July in 1830, and in the same year, he and his partners opened the first machine-based clothing manufacturing company in the world, designed to create uniforms for the French army. Unfortunately, sewing machine inventors seem to have a poor track record as far as fire risk is concerned. Certainly, Timonier's factory was burned down, reportedly by workers who were worried about losing their livelihood when they saw the issue of the patent. Now, over in America, a man called Walter Hunt joined the party, bringing his contribution in 1832 in the form of the first lock-stitch machine. Up till then, the machines had used a simple chain stitch, but the lock stitch was a big step forward because it allowed for tighter, more durable seams of the kind needed in many clothes. It wasn't without its teething troubles, and Hunt only sold a handful of machines. In fact, he only bothered to patent his idea much later, in 1854. Meanwhile, a couple of British inventors, Newton and Archibald, improved on the emerging technology with a better needle and the use of two pressing surfaces to keep pieces of fabric in position. And they did that in 1841. And someone else, John Greenhoff, invented a patent for the first sewing machine in the United States in 1842. Now, each of these machines had some of the important elements, but it was only in 1844 that they converged into the machine built by the English inventor John Fisher. So all should have been well, except that apparent curse of incomplete patent filing, which seems to have afflicted many sewing machine inventors, struck Fisher down. His patent was delayed, and he failed to get the recognition he probably deserves as the architect of the modern sewing machine. Instead, it was Elias Howe from America with his 1845 machine, which closely resembled Fisher's, who took the title. His patent was for a process that uses thread from two different sources, building on the idea of a lock stitch, which, if you remember, William Hunt had actually developed 13 years earlier. For Hunt, his failure to patent this meant that Howe eventually reaped the not inconsiderable rewards, earning him $5 for every sewing machine sold in America, which used the lock-stitch principle. Howe's machine was impressive, but like all the others, it was slow to take off. So he decided to try and market it in Europe, sailing for England, and leaving the American market open for other entrants, including one, Isaac Merritt Singer, who patented his machine in 1851. Now, Singer had become interested in sewing machines by trying to make them better. Orson Phelps, in whose machine shop Singer was working, had recently started making sewing machines for a modestly successful American company, Leroy and Blodgett. And so his friends Ziba and Phelps convinced Singer to take a look at that machine to see if he could improve on its design. Legend has it that Singer was somewhat skeptical at first, questioning its market potential. You want to do away with the only thing that keeps women quiet? That's probably an urban myth. But anyway, Phelps and Ziba managed to persuade Singer, and in 1850, the three men formed a partnership. Ziba put up the money, Singer did the inventing, and Phelps provided the manufacturing. Now, instead of repairing the machine, Singer redesigned it by installing a treadle to help power the fabric feed and rethinking the way the shuttle mechanism worked, replacing the curved needle with a straight one. Like Henry Ford after him, Singer's gift wasn't in pure invention, but rather in adapting and recombining different elements. His eventual design for a machine brought together elements from Timonier, Hunt, and Howe's machines. And the idea of using a foot treadle to leave both hands free dated back to the Middle Ages. Importantly, the new design caused less thread breakage, with the innovation of an arm-like apparatus that extended over the work table, holding the needle at its end. This machine could sew 900 stitches a minute, which was a dramatic improvement over what an accomplished seamstress could achieve a rate of about 40 stitches a minute on simple work. On an item as complex as a shirt, the time required could be reduced from 15 hours to less than 1. Singer obtained US patent number 8294 for his improvements on August 12, 1851. But having perfected the machine, there were a couple of obstacles in the way of their reaping the rewards from transforming the market. First was the problem of economics. Their machine and others like it opened up the possibility for selling for home use, but at $125 each, that's about $4,000 in today's money, the machines were way too expensive and therefore slow to catch on. And then there was the small matter of sorting out the legal tangles involved in the intellectual property rights to sewing machinery. Elias Howe had been understandably annoyed to find Singer's machine was using elements of his own patent, and so duly took him to court for patent infringement. Singer, in his defense, tried to argue that Howe had actually infringed upon William Hunt's original idea for the lock stitch. Unfortunately for him, since Hunt hadn't patented yet, that argument failed. The judge ruled that Hunt's lock stitch idea was free for anyone, including Howe, to use. Consequently, Singer was forced to pay a lump sum and patent royalties to Howe. In a twist, if John Fisher's UK patent hadn't been filed wrongly, he too would have been drawn into the lawsuit, since both Howe and Singer's designs were pretty close to the one that Fisher had created. Is this beginning to sound complicated? It gets worse, mainly because they weren't the only ones in the game. Inventors like Alan B. Wilson were slugging it out with others like John Bradshaw. Both of them had developed and patented devices which improved upon Singer and Howe's ideas. Wilson had partnered up with someone called Nathaniel Wheeler to produce a new machine which used a hook instead of a shuttle and offered much quieter and smoother operation. That helped the Wheeler and Wilson Company make and sell more machines in the 1850s and 1860s than any other manufacturer. Wilson also invented the feed mechanism that's still used on every sewing machine today, one which draws the cloth through the machine in a smooth and even fashion. There were others like Charles Miller, who patented machinery to help with accessories like buttonhole stitching. The result was that in the 1850s, a rapidly increasing number of companies were vying with each other not only to produce sewing machines, but also to file lawsuits for patent infringement by the others. It became known as the Sewing Machine War, and like most wars, risked ending up benefiting no one. It's an old story, and often a vicious and expensive one, in which the lawyers end up the only certain winners. But fortunately, this one, though not without its battles, was to arrive at a mutually successful ceasefire. In 1856, the major manufacturers, including Singer, Wheeler and Wilson and others, met in Albany, New York, and Orlando Potter, who was president of Grover and Baker Company, proposed that rather than squander their profits on litigation, they pool their patents. They agreed to form the Sewing Machine Combination, merging 9 of the most important patents. They were able to secure the cooperation of Elias Howe by offering him a royalty on every sewing machine manufactured. Any other manufacturer had to obtain a license for $15 per machine. Now, this arrangement lasted until 1877, when the last patent expired. So the stage was finally set for Isaac Singer to act his most famous role, one which predated Henry Ford, as one of the fathers of mass production. In late 1857, Singer opened the world's first facility for mass producing something other than firearms. And he opened that in New York and was soon able to cut production costs. Sales volume increased rapidly. In 1855, he sold 855. A year later, over 2,500, and in 1858, production reached nearly 4,000, and he opened 3 more New York-based manufacturing plants. Efficiency in production allowed the price of the product to drop to $100, then $60, then $30. By 1860, they were selling over 13,000 machines, and Singer became the largest manufacturer of sewing machines in the world. 10 years later, that number had risen tenfold. 20 years on, they sold 500,000 machines a year. Now, like Ford, Singer was something of a visionary, seeing the value of a systems approach to the problem of making and selling machines. His was a recombinant approach, taking ideas like standardized and interchangeable parts, division of labor, specialization of key managerial roles, and intensive mechanization to mass produce and bring costs down. His thespian skills were also usefully deployed in the marketing campaign. Amongst other stunts, he staged demonstrations of the sewing machine in city centre shop windows, where bystanders could watch as a skilled young woman effortlessly sewed her own creations. And Singer was famous, amongst other things, for his Song of the Shirt number, which he'd deliver as background accompaniment in events at which, once again, an attractive and also accomplished seamstress would demonstrate the product. Now, it's often easy to overlook the contribution of others in the innovation story, not least when the chief protagonist is an actor with a gift for self-publicity. So actually, much of the development of the Singer sewing machine business was down to the ideas and efforts of Singer's partner at the time, Edward Cabot Clark. It was Clark, for example, who came up with the concept of installment purchasing plans, which literally opened the door to many salesmen trying to push the product. Clark also suggested the model of trading in an older model for a newer one with upgraded features, something enthusiastically deployed a century later in the promotion of a host of products, from smartphones to saloon cars. So Singer and Clark worked to create the necessary infrastructure to support scaling the business. They opened attractive showrooms. They developed a rapid spare parts distribution system and employed a network of repair mechanics. Now, this emerging market for domestic sewing machines attracted others into the game. In 1863, an enterprising tailor, Ebenezer Butterick, began selling dress patterns, and with them helped open up the home dressmaking business. Magazines, pattern books, sewing circles emerged as women saw the opportunities in doing something which could bring both social and sometimes economic benefit to their lives. Schools and colleges began offering courses to teach the required skills, many of them helpfully sponsored by the Singer Sewing Machine Company. It wasn't just a new business opportunity. This movement provided impetus to a redefinition of the role of women in the home and their access to activity which could become more than a simple hobby. Singer's advertising put women in control, with advertisements suggesting that the Singer machine was sold only by the maker directly to the women of the family. Charitable groups such as the Ladies' Work Society or the Cooperative Needlewomen's Society emerged, which were aimed at helping poorer women find useful skills and respectable employment in sewing. By 1863, Singer's machine had become America's most popular sewing machine and was on its way to a similar worldwide reputation. The company pioneered international manufacturing, particularly in their presence in Europe, having first tried to enter the overseas market through licensing their patents to others. Trouble was, with doing that, quality and service problems emerged which forced them to rethink. So they moved instead to setting up their own facilities. Their Clydebank complex in Scotland opened in 1885, and it actually became the world's largest sewing machine factory, with 2 main buildings on 3 levels. One made domestic machines, the other industrial models. The whole thing was overseen by a giant 60-meter-high tower with the name Singer emblazoned on it, with 4 clock faces, the world's largest. It employed over 3,500 people and turned out 8,000 sewing machines a week. By the 1900s, it was making over 1.5 million machines to be sewn around the world. Estimates place Singer's market share at that time around 80% of global production from at least 1880 through to 1920 and beyond. Over 1,000 different models for industrial and home use were offered. Singer ended up with 1,700 stores in the United States and 4,500 overseas, supported by 60,000 salesmen. But back to Isaac Singer. Singer was a big man with a commanding presence and a huge appetite for experiences. But he had no need of a Shakespeare to conjure up a plot for his own dramatic personal life. His was quite rich enough. The kind where it might help to have a few thousand miles of Atlantic Ocean to place between you and what's going on when your past is suddenly and rapidly catching up with you. Pay attention, this gets even more complicated than the patent thicket we described earlier. Catherine Daly, his first wife, had separated from Singer way back in the 1830s, but had remained married to him, benefiting from his payments to her. She finally agreed to a divorce in 1860, at which point his long-suffering mistress and mother of 8 of his children, Mary Ann Sponsler, believed that Isaac was now free to marry her. But he wasn't keen to change his arrangement, and in any case, the question became somewhat academic, because in 1860, as Mary Ann was riding in her carriage along Fifth Avenue in New York, she happened to see Isaac in another carriage seated alongside Mary McGonigal. She was one of Isaac's employees, about whom Mary Ann Sponsler had already got some suspicions. Confronting him, she discovered that not only had Singer fathered 7 children with Mary McGonigal, he'd also had an affair with her sister Kate. As they say, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and Mary Ann really went for Isaac, having him arrested and charged with bigamy. He fled, not surprisingly, to London on bail, taking Mary McGonigal with him, but leaving behind even more trouble, because further research uncovered a 4th wife, another Mary Walters this time, who'd been one of his glamorous sewing machine demonstrators. She also added another child to the list of his offspring. In fact, the final tally of his New York wives netted a total of 4 families, all living in Manhattan in ignorance of each other, and a total of 16 children. Isaac's escape to England allowed him enough breathing space to pick up on another affair he'd started, in France this time, the previous year, with a woman called Isabella Boyer, a young French woman whose face had, amongst other things, been the model for the Statue of Liberty. Singer had managed to leave her pregnant, and so eventually she left her husband, moved to England to join him. And they did marry in 1863. They settled down to life on their huge estate in Devon and had a further 6 children. So what of Singer's legacy? Well, Isaac Singer left behind a lot, not least a huge fortune. On his death in 1871, he was worth around $13 million. That's got to be close to around 400 billion today. From considerably humble beginnings, he'd managed to make his way to a position where he was able to buy a sizable plot of land near Torquay and build a grand 110-room house, Old Way, modelled on the royal palace at Versailles and complete with a hall of mirrors, a maze, and a grotto in the garden. And when he was finally laid to rest, it was in a cedar, silver, satin, and oak-lined marble tomb, in a funeral attended by over 2,000 mourners. His wider legacy is, of course, the sewing machine, which formed the basis of the company he helped found, and which eventually became such a powerful symbol of industrial and social innovation. And he reminds us that innovation isn't a single flash of inspiration, but an extended journey. He deployed his skills at navigating that journey in many directions. He's of course remembered for his product innovations, particularly the sewing machine, but throughout his life he developed many other ideas into serviceable and sometimes profitable ventures. But he also pioneered extensive process innovation, anticipating Henry Ford's mass production approach to change the economics of selling consumer goods and rethinking the ways in which his factories could continue to develop. He had the salesman's gift, but his wasn't just an easy patter to explain or to persuade reluctant adopters to take something new on. Together with Edward Clark, he pioneered ways of targeting and then opening up new markets, particularly in the emerging world of the domestic consumer. And he was above all a systems thinker, recognizing that success or failure of innovation depends on thinking around a complete business model to ensure that good ideas have an architecture through which they can create value. Now, Isaac Singer retained his interest in drama right up until his death, leaving his adopted home of Torbay with a selection of imposing theatres, some of which still offer performances today. So it can probably only be a matter of time before someone puts together the script for a show based on this much larger-than-life character.